Good evening, everybody. I'll give you all a moment to connect in. Let your audio fire up. I think most of you seem like you've got your audio connected now, which is great. Okay, welcome everybody to another week of our Civics and Citizenship professional learning programs. This suite of professional learning sessions is brought to you by the Parliament of South Australia, the Commissioner for Children and Young People, and the Department for Education. This week, we'll be talking about how a referendum process works. And this is very timely given some of the updates over the course of the week. As I do every week, I would love to acknowledge that I'm on Kaurna land today, and I acknowledge that they are the traditional owners of this land that I'm on. I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And I also like to reflect on how the Kaurna people and First Nations people had systems of customary law in place well before some of the regimes that we're talking about existed. And if you would like to acknowledge country in the chat this week to let us know where you're coming from, that would be really lovely. Now, this week, we've got a bit of an interesting session because it's sort of structured in two parts. So there are two of us having a bit of a dialogue with each other and with you. So you'll be hearing from me at the Parliament of South Australia, your regular Natalie from Parliament House. But we are also joined by Cornelia Koch from the University of Adelaide. And so you should be able to see Cornelia's video on. And Cornelia is one of the senior lecturers in law in the University of Adelaide's Law School. And she's actually a education specialist and a really wonderful resource for us to have online tonight as someone who has done teaching in the constitutional law space and has that academic lens and background. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, Cornelia. And the way that we'll start the session is I'm going to talk you through the bare bones process of a referendum, and I'm politically neutral in my role in Parliament, so it will be process driven, and I will show you some teaching tips that I think might make it quite interesting. And then Cornelia might jump in and have some conversations with me about the process. But then in the second half of the session, we'll have Cornelia talk to you about some of the background to the 2023 Voice referendum, starting with the Uluru Statement of the Heart. So hopefully you find it helpful for the upcoming weeks where you might get a lot of student questions and you'll be doing a lot of teaching in this space. The key questions that I want to answer for you in my component of the session are: what is the Constitution? What is a referendum? What is the process to change the Constitution, and how do we determine the result? And I thought that I would launch a bit of a poll to see how you feel about some of this in advance. I'm not sure the background of knowledge of all of you in this session tonight. So if I launch the poll, I think I've got 3 questions coming up for you. The first is about how well you think you understand the referendum process. The second is, when was the last time we had a referendum in Australia? And the third is, how do we know if a referendum has been successful? So have a go at completing the questions there, and let's see how you feel about the referendum process just before we launch into our learning. Okay, I can see a few of you. I'll showcase some of the results when we've got most of the responses through. We've got about 50% of the participants who have completed. This is really helpful for me to understand, and hopefully Cornelia as well, to understand where we're going to direct our content or the most of our time and attention tonight. So thank you very much. I'll give it another minute or so for you all to pop your answers in. It's quite enjoyable for me in the background to see the numbers tick along and monitor the responses coming through. All right, we're almost there. Okay. if you haven't done it yet, I'm going to give you about 10 more seconds, so that way I don't have dead air. I'm talking like I'm on the radio. All right, let's have a look. We'll share the results. So it looks like a lot of you are jumping online tonight to try and improve your understanding of the referendum process, and some of you are learning it for the first time. And for those of you who are familiar with it or are looking for a refresh, hopefully we can inspire you. But thank you for letting us know that some of you are learning this for the first time. This is an interesting one. When was the last time we have a referendum in Australia? The correct answer was the 1999 Australian Republic. We'll unpack the difference between the 2017 same-sex marriage postal survey later on. And I'm quite delighted to show you that you've mostly all answered, or the majority have answered with the correct response for how we know whether a referendum has been successful. A majority of people in a majority of states, but we'll unpack that a bit later. So thank you for indulging me with the poll. I have always wanted to scope out my learners' prior knowledge that way, so it's a bit of fun. Let's talk about the Constitution. So if I said, what's the Australian Constitution? You're welcome to drop into the chat or turn your microphone on. How would you describe the function of our Australian Constitution, or what it is? A set of rules to run the country? Yeah? A guidebook for the running of a nation. Our Australian Constitution is not as big as what you think it is. When you get a copy of it, it looks like a small booklet. It's not too large. Hopefully you can see on my screen. It's got 8 chapters, 128 sections, and it's the basis for our federal system of government. I've put some notes on the screen of what the Constitution contains. It sets out how our federal parliament works and the structures of the House of Representatives and the Senate. It includes power sharing arrangements between the federal parliament and the states. It structures the High Court of Australia and its role in interpreting the Constitution. There are lots of things that the Constitution does not include, and some of these things are interpreted or taken as convention from the Westminster system. So there's no reference to a Prime Minister in our Constitution. There's no Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And if you have never looked at it before, the Australian Constitution is available as an online searchable through ausconstitution.peo.gov.au. And I might swap into it so you can see how great this little constitutional resource is. I have to pop you onto my browser. But the searchable online Constitution lets you click through into all of the different chapters, and you can easily explore the Constitution through this resource. So chapter 1 explains the Parliament. You can click into chapter 2 for the executive, the judiciary, and then right down to what we're going to talk about tonight, the alteration of the Constitution. So if you haven't browsed the Constitution before, this digital tool is a really great way to have access to it and maybe share it in your classroom with your students. It's very intuitive, and it includes a link to order the physical pocket constitutions as well. Now, the Constitution Online is a really great source, and it's applicable to most of the teachers who are covering Year 7 and Year 9 Civics and Citizenship at the moment. I know that a lot of you will be coming on from earlier years, and you might want the information tonight to support your own understanding of the referendum process. But in terms of the curriculum, the Australian Constitution sits very neatly in Year 7, so understanding the key features of our system of government, including the Constitution. And for Year 9, you need to understand the process for constitutional change through a referendum. So if we've got Year 9 teachers on tonight, this is your time. Hopefully this will support you. So
Natalie,
yes.
Can I just really briefly jump in?
Yes.
So hello everyone, Cornelia. I just want to say, when you're looking at the Constitution, whether with your students or for your own purposes, so a colleague of mine has coined this wonderful phrase that the Australian Constitution doesn't say what it does and doesn't do what it says. So effectively, when you read it, don't believe anything it says, because it's probably not doing that anymore. So in that sense, while I think all the relevant principles that Natalie had there just on the screen before, you have to explain to your students, you will probably confuse them a lot if you're trying to go to the constitutional source of it, the actual section. because many parts at least really do not say in their wording what it actually is, how the government works. So this is only a brief note of caution. In case you find that what you read in the Constitution is completely different to what you expected to find, there's nothing wrong with you. It's just the Constitution doesn't say what the reality of how our system of government actually is.
And thank you so much, Cornelia. It's very true. And this leads into one of the notes that I'm going to talk now when we think about changing the Constitution. And there are different methods of changing the Constitution. One is very practical, which we'll talk about tonight, but the other one is a bit more theoretical, and it's through High Court interpretation. So the High Court of Australia, which is set out in our Australian Constitution, has original jurisdiction. So this means it's primary and invested function to interpret the Australian Constitution. So if there was ever a query about what wording in the Constitution means, the High Court gets to make the decision. And sometimes the decisions that the High Court makes in terms of the wording in the Constitution or what a section means can completely change the way that a section of the Constitution operates or is perceived. And I have an example here. I've said Brisbane, and this is a famous case. And in the 1930s, Australians had to pay a licence fee to own and listen to a radio. And Brisbane faced criminal charges because she didn't have a wireless radio licence. And instead of paying the fine, she challenged that the Commonwealth had an ability to impose a tax on wireless radio because radio wasn't listed as one of the responsibilities in the Constitution. So there's a section in the Constitution that explains all of the different responsibilities of the federal parliament. This is section 51. And it gave the Commonwealth power to make laws about postal, telegraphic, and other like services. And the issue was whether wireless radio is a like service. Is it like postal services? Is it like telegraphic services? Is it similar enough to post and telegraphs that it could fit within section 51? And the High Court made a decision and they interpreted the Constitution to say that wireless radio is a similar service. It is a like service because like post and telegraphs, the radio is a form of communication. And so the way that the High Court interpreted the Constitution has meant that the Commonwealth, the federal level, has now got lawmaking power over any new technology that serves as a form of communication. So it caught the radio, but now televisions, the internet. And so the High Court greatly expanded the Commonwealth's power at the state's expense, really. And this is one of the things I think, relating to what Cornelia said before, the Constitution might say telegraphic, postal and other like services, but that's not necessarily the whole story because the High Court might have made a decision that impacts the interpretation of the Constitution and they've made a change, or we also have a law that exists that supports the framework that's set out in the Constitution. So one of the ways the Constitution can be changed is through High Court interpretation. That's not changing the physical words in the Constitution, it's just changing our understanding of them. We're going to look at how we physically change the words of the Constitution or how we change this document itself. And the Constitution is quite handy in that it provides the process for it in section 128. So in section 128 of the Australian Constitution, it's actually in its own chapter, chapter 8. It gives you quite a wordy dialogue on how you change the Constitution. I don't propose to read it to you because the language is quite, well, I want to say complex, but the sentences are quite long and you really do need to unpack it word for word. But it explains that a majority of each house of the federal parliament has to pass a law requesting an alteration to the Constitution, and it needs to be submitted to each state and territory to the electors qualified to vote, and it needs to be passed by an a double majority, which I'll unpack for you later. So section 128 of the Constitution gives you the alteration process. A referendum, the section 128 referendum process, is quite different to other types of votes. It's not a general election. So I noticed in the poll at the start, some of you hit the button thinking that the 2022 federal election was the last time we had a referendum. A referendum is a very specific type of vote, and it's a vote to change the constitution. So it's not a general election. It's also not a plebiscite. It's also not a postal survey. A referendum is a specific vote to change the Australian Constitution, and it has legal force. If the result of the referendum is that the nation has agreed to change the Constitution, it has to be done. It has legal force. And the last time this happened in Australia, the last time a question was put forward was in 1999. And the question was whether we wanted to establish the Commonwealth of Australia as a republic, with the Queen and the Governor General being replaced by a president, which was appointed by a 2/3 majority of the members of the Commonwealth Parliament. That question did not succeed. The referendum questions that we had prior to 1999, I put another previous one from 1988, was whether local government should be recognised in the Constitution, which also did not pass. So a referendum is a very, very different type of vote to a general election. It's also not a plebiscite. A plebiscite decides a national question, but it does not change the Constitution. It does not have legal force. And a lot of people thought that the same-sex marriage postal survey was a plebiscite. That's a slightly different process again, but a plebiscite, we had some in 1916 and 1917 to get the national question about conscription during the First World War. A postal survey, that was carried out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It was not carried out by the Australian Electoral Commission. It does not change the Constitution, and it does not have legal force. So the 2017 question on same-sex marriage was not a referendum question to change the Constitution. It was a postal survey. So there are some distinctions between them, and a referendum is quite significant in that it carries legal force. So with the Constitution's framework in section 128, we can break down a referendum process chart for you. And I'm going to talk you through it. So this chart is directly from the Australian Electoral Commission, and you'll get these slides, and there's a source on here for you. And I'll walk you through step by step. So the first step is that a proposed law, a bill, is introduced into either house of the federal parliament, a constitutional alteration bill. It could start in the Senate. It could start in the House of Representatives. As an example, the voice bill started in the House of Representatives in this instance, but it could have started in the Senate if it was introduced there. It would need to be passed by an absolute majority in the first House of Parliament where it was introduced. So if it started in the House of Representatives, an absolute majority is 76 out of 151 members. If it started in the Senate, your absolute majority would be 39 out of 76 senators. So the bill needs to be passed by an absolute majority in the originating house. If it doesn't pass with an absolute majority in the originating house, the process would not go forward. The bill then, if it does pass in the originating house, it goes forward to be considered in the other House of Parliament. And if it started in the House of Representatives, it would move on to the Senate. And the Senate would consider it, and it would need to pass by an absolute majority in that House of Parliament. So again, 76 out of 151 or 39 out of 76. Now, if it doesn't get passed by an absolute majority in the second house, the Constitution actually does outline a process of what would happen if one house has an absolute majority and the other doesn't. It is set out in the Constitution. I've tried to shorten it for you, which is always a risk in this space, but the first house can have a go again, and then the Governor General can take control. However, we won't unpack that level of detail right now. I just want to assure you that it's in the Constitution. After both houses of Parliament have passed it with an absolute majority, the referendum process can begin. There is a minimum of 2 months and a maximum of 6 months after the bill has passed before the referendum needs to occur. So we are now operating within a time window, which I'll show you in a moment, for the 2023 voice referendum to occur. So this dotted line that runs along the side shows you where the time limit applies. So you have to have 2 months after the bill and no more than 6 months after the bill for the referendum to occur. The members of Parliament who support the change, who want to see the change, get to put a yes case together. The members of Parliament who oppose the change prepare a no case, and our Australian Electoral Commission print and distribute the information leaflets to all electors on the electoral roll. So really important to make sure that within this 2-month window, you make sure you get yourself on the electoral roll. And if you're teaching senior secondary students, get them onto the electoral roll too. The date for the referendum will be called. The Governor-General will issue writs to call a referendum. And then once the referendum takes place, the outcome will be decided whether or not we have a double majority or not a double majority. I'll explain that in a moment, to determine whether or not it was successful. So this is the process that we can extract from the Constitution, but there is also a piece of legislation called the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act 1984. And this explains the really technical day-to-day operational processes for conducting a referendum. So if the Constitution is your guide or sets out the process, the Referendum Machinery Provisions gives you the nitty-gritty. It tells you when the Governor-General issues writs, how many days the writs need to be returned by, how the referendum process is administered by the Australian Electoral Commission, and so on. So I will give you links to be able to view these online. I just thought I might do a brief pause to check in with the chat and see how you're all going. I can't see any questions, but please feel free to drop any questions in there. What I have done for you on the slide that you should be able to see on your screen now is I've updated it, but I've stamped it with the current 2023 voice referendum dates and process to show you where we are. So the proposed bill was introduced into either House of the Federal Parliament. The Constitution Alteration Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice Bill was introduced into the House of Representatives, and it was introduced on the 30th of March. We call that the first reading when the bill is introduced into the House of Representatives. The bill is passed by an absolute majority. This occurred on the 31st of May. It received 121 ayes, which is far more than the 76 majority required, and 25 noes. For those of you who are familiar with the passage of a bill process, I've also extracted the other steps for you. So the first reading, the introduction, the second reading, the key debate, occurred between the 30th of March and the 31st of May. They actually did a little bit of a committee inquiry during that point to gauge public perception and put some recommendations on the referendum together. The consideration and detail stage is where they can make changes to the bill. That occurred on the 31st of May, and then you have your third reading. So if you're really into your passage of a bill process, I've got a link for you where you can see these dates and track the passage of that bill. When it passed on the 31st of May, it gets sent over to the Senate for it to be considered in the second house. So it was introduced on the 13th of June into the Senate for its first reading. They did their second reading over a couple of days between the 13th of June and the 16th of June. Their committee of the whole stage is where they make amendments. That was on the 16th of June. And it passed only 2 days ago, the third reading on the 19th of June, and it had 52 ayes and 19 noes. So it was very clear of that 39 majority, which we discussed before. So I put a little star on the slide for you to show you where we're at now. The referendum process is about to begin. So we've got 2 months before the referendum can occur now from the 19th of June, but it has to occur before 6 months have expired beyond the 19th of June. So before the 19th of December, we'll be seeing a referendum take place. Are there any questions on any of that so far? No? Before I move on to this next part, I just might stop my screen for a moment so I can show you in my browser a couple of the resources that might support you. So one of the things that we've got on the Australian Electoral Commission's website is a bit of a referendum hub. So they have Referendum 101, some video campaigns and content to understand the referendum process. The Australian Electoral Commission is your primary source or your key source of information for the referendum process. In their teacher resources kit, they have a constitutional referendum brochure, a flowchart of the referendum process. So a lot of these charts that I've provided to you, you can download them for yourself. If you want to have a look at the passage of the bill through the federal parliament, the link that I've put on the slides for you opens up to a page like this, and you can see all of the date stamps and the relevant documents relating to the passage of the referendum bill through the federal parliament. And then the other thing that I have linked for you, and I'll put this in the sources or resources for you later, is where you can access the Referendum Machinery Provisions Act. So if you really want to, you can have a look at the detail that's in here. So for example, what happens with postal voting for a referendum, how a referendum is scrutinised, how you disclose referendum expenditure. So all of the details are available for you there. Are there any questions on any of that so far? I'm really mindful of not ignoring you or providing you help if you need it. It's okay. I'm just going to assume that you're just taking it all in like sponges. So I nearly finished the part that I would like to talk to you about. And before you all came online, we were having an interesting conversation about the yes case and the no case. So if we look at the flow chart before, the referendum process begins and the members of parliament who support the change have to put a yes case together, and the members of parliament who oppose the change have to put a no case together. And in the news yesterday, the Australian Electoral Commission notified all of the politicians that they have to submit their yes or no essays by the 17th of July for inclusion on the official information pamphlet. The pamphlet's going to be about 20 pages long. It's going to be sent at least 2 weeks before the voting day. And the Electoral Commissioner said that they're going to be printing about 12.5 million copies in 34 languages, which is pretty massive. It's a huge organisational exercise. But the most interesting thing about this, and something you might want to talk to Cornelia about when Cornelia jumps online, is that the Electoral Commission says that they have no editorial role in the essays. They're going to produce them verbatim. They're not going to check them for fact or for misinformation. So these yes or no cases will be prepared by these politicians and will be sent out to households. But there's no fact checking that's taking place. And it even notes that politicians need to be careful about their language and grammar. They're going to be so removed from the essay process, the Electoral Commission won't even be tidying up their language and grammar for them from the sounds of it. This is quite significant, and I believe Cornelia will be talking to you about misinformation. Is there anything that you wanted to add at this point, Cornelia?
Yeah, I might just jump in on this point right now, because now is a good time, I think. So yeah, what's important is the Referendum Machinery Act that Natalie was talking about earlier, when that was amended this year and debated, actually last year, and debated, following the advice of independent political science and constitutional law experts, there were very strong recommendations made not to have this pamphlet, the yes and no pamphlet, and instead have a document that is fact-checked and is written by independent experts that would provide a breakdown of the relevant yes and no arguments, but independent of politicians. And however, in the end, and through political negotiations, it was determined in Parliament to continue to have the yes-no pamphlet. Now, Senator Pocock moved an amendment at the time that there should be yes or no, but they should then be fact-checked by independent experts before it goes to the Electoral Commission, but that was rejected. So it means that what will happen in practice is now those people in Parliament who voted no will get together, effectively form a committee, and draft their arguments for no. And those people who voted yes will get together, basically form a committee and draft their arguments for yes. This will not be fact-checked by anyone. And unfortunately, Australia does not have any rules, as other countries do, of that you have to be truthful in politics or in political advertising. So the experience from past referendums, because these pamphlets have been around since the 1912 referendum, has been that huge amounts of misinformation has been put in these pamphlets, which are simply factually completely incorrect. But because the idea is that politicians would never do that. However, the experience is that they do that because obviously it's part of it's part of their political persona, effectively. So that means that when these pamphlets come out, I think it's going to be very important to not take them at face value, whatever they say, but rather there will definitely be expert fact checks on the pamphlets. So once they come out, I'm very sure the various universities and their fact-checking programs are going to be publishing fact checks on the pamphlet and saying what's correct and what's incorrect. And I think it's going to be very important for yourselves, but also to recommend to other people and also tell your students that while these pamphlets will be going to households, they should be read in conjunction with independent expert advice on what of those things is factually correct and what's factually incorrect. That's all I want to say on this point.
No, thank you. And I think that's an incredibly important point because, you know, as humanities teachers, source analysis and fact-checking sources and trying to make sure that we're using the most reliable information is part of our teaching process. But some people who are receiving this in the mail might not be applying that level of critical analysis, and we need to be having the conversation about checking facts for yourself or referring to, you know, reliable academic, peer-reviewed sources where they will be able to check misinformation for you. I nearly finished my component, and what I wanted to do is show you what the ballot paper will roughly look like and what needs to be done, because it's not a normal election ballot paper. It doesn't involve numbers, it involves writing. And then I've got a little teaching exercise that I thought you might find helpful for understanding this double majority I've been alluding to. So the ballot paper has several parts. It has directions to voters on them. Hopefully you can all see this on the screen very clearly. So we've got directions to voter. You need to write yes or no in the space provided opposite the question below. Okay, so you're not doing 1, 2, 3, 4. You're not doing ticks and crosses. You have to write yes or you have to write no. And that's a really big step. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that it's not just a tick or a cross. You have to physically write the word yes, or you have to physically write the word no. So really important, particularly like in your personal capacity or in your personal lives, but also for making sure you're communicating to students how the process works. Writing yes or no is the key step. The next thing is the question. So on this sample ballot paper, it says a proposed law. There would be a description here. I've actually got the description for you on the other side of the screen. So it's a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And then it will say, do you approve this proposed alteration? Write yes or no in the box. Hopefully, this doesn't look too overwhelming for you. It's just really critical to land that numbers or ticks are not going to cut it on these types of ballot papers. In the 1999 referendum, there were multiple questions being asked at the same referendum. So there was one about becoming a republic, but there was also one about changing the preamble or changing some of the wording in our constitution. So there were two different coloured ballot papers. They were buff and mauve for those of you who were around in 1999 and you remember that referendum. So you'll have a single ballot paper this time because there aren't multiple questions being asked. I'm going to leave this because Cornelia will talk about the constitutional impact in her section shortly, but I want to talk about how we get a result. And in the poll at the start, I asked you what we had to do to get a successful result for a referendum. And most of you gave me the correct answer. We need this double majority. Oh, and Cornelia has just dropped in the chat that the AEC has a practice option on its website, which is fantastic. And Rachel has asked, will we get to see the exact wording that will be inserted into the Constitution before the referendum? Yes, it is already available and Cornelia will be showing it to you shortly. I actually had it on the slide before, but Cornelia will talk about it in more detail in the next half of this session. Are we allowed to use a screenshot of this slide? I can do you one better. All of that's available on the Electoral Commission website as a direct source. So obviously you can use mine and you can unpack it, but you may as well get it straight from the Electoral Commission or do the practice ballot paper yourself. Thank you for the questions. It's nice to know that you're out there and that you're not sort of struggling under the burden of everything I'm trying to say to you. So how do we get a result? The Australian Constitution can only be changed, the wording of it can only be changed with the support of the majority of Australian votes. So this is a majority of the population, the voting population, and a majority of votes in a majority of states. So at least 4 states. We call this the double majority. And here's a pretty diagram of the double majority. So a referendum is passed when a national majority, so more than half of the voters from all states and territories say yes. So this is the top blue diagram. And then the second part of that double majority process is that you need more than half of voters in at least 4 of the 6 states saying yes. So you can see here, WA said yes, Queensland said yes, Victoria said yes, Tassie said yes, SA and New South Wales, no. What's not counted in the double majority, or what's not counted in this second half of the diagram here? Who's not included there? I just saw someone mouth it in their video. The territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, which is a really interesting conversation for you to have with your students, like whether or not this double majority process is holding up with the test of time by not counting the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory. And in relation to the voice referendum specifically, the Indigenous population of the Northern Territory and the Northern Territory not being included for the double majority. I can leave that conversation for you to have within your classrooms, but a really cool thing that you can do is go on the Australian Bureau of Statistics and pull out the population data for each state and territory and unpack and see how much of the population is not being counted for the purposes of that second part of the double majority process. So if we have a look at the second diagram, the one that's purple in the bottom corner, so a referendum is not passed, and you can see the and or in the middle. So if a national majority, more than half of the voters from all of the states say no, we can't go anywhere. If a majority of in at least 3 states vote no, then we can't go any further. So you need to have both. And if one of these situations happens, so a national majority says no, but then you've got 4 out of 6 say yes, it still won't pass. If you've got a national majority that says yes, but only 3 out of 4 states say yes, it won't pass. You need to have both elements of this double majority. And I thought we would have a practice go at you telling me whether this is a successful referendum result. This is something that you can do with your students, and I'm happy for you to take these and use them on your own, or you can come up with your own models. But I would like you to have a look at this chart and tell me whether or not we've got a double majority. Would anyone like to drop in the chat, or you can turn on your mic and tell me if we've got a double majority? So you can see the total population vote in the first 2 columns where the ACT and the Northern Territory is included. And then where it says state majority, I've indicated yes or no, but I've blacked out the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. So someone in the chat said, yes, this is a successful referendum result. Correct, because you've got a majority of the population, you've got 60, 50. So 60 is definitely a majority out of their 110 there. And you've got 4 out of 6 states saying yes. So we've met the double majority. Someone in the chat just said, does it mean that the people in the territories will not have any say? They accounted for the national majority part, so the total population vote, but not the second part of the double majority, which is the majority of people in the majority of states. In the states. Does that make sense? Just making sure. I think I can see some nods. Okay. How about this example here? Would this be a successful referendum result? No. Rachel says no. Why not, Rachel? Did we get a majority of the population? National majority? No, we didn't. So 47 yes, 53 no. And did we get a majority of the states? No. So only 2 out of 6 said yes. So this failed both elements of the double majority. How about this one here? Do we have a successful referendum result? You're shaking your head. Let's see. Someone can drop into a chat. What's the situation with this one? Rachel says, no, we don't have a majority of states. Great. So we've got a majority of the population. So this is where the ACT and the Northern Territory, their numbers might make a difference to the outcome. So we've got a majority of the population. Then you've got 3 out of the 6 states saying yes, and we need that 4. Okay. Let's have a look at this one. Is this going to meet it? Some shaking of heads. No, so we don't have the national majority. We've got the state majority, but not the national majority. Okay. So hopefully that's a little activity. You can give your students multiple charts or different ways to unpack the double majority and get them to check a result. I actually think that's a really practical way for them to do it. Or conduct a referendum in your classroom, designate each table a jurisdiction, and then get them to unpack it. So I think I've reached the end of the component that I'm going to work through with you today, because I think we've answered the key questions. So what's the relevance of our constitution to this conversation? What is a referendum? What is the process, and how do we get a result? So with that in mind, I'm going to wrap up my part, and I would love for you to have an ongoing conversation with me about this to make sure that you're supported in whatever way you need. But I will now throw it over to Cornelia. I'm sorry, Cornelia, that I took a few extra moments, because Cornelia will then start speaking to you about the background to the 2023 voice.
Thanks very much, Natalie. So yes, sorry, I just have to get my screen a bit more organized. Why is it always on this? I don't go on this slide. Sorry, so obviously I'm sharing my screen, as you can see, but I'm all right. So thanks very much, Natalie. Yeah, look, Natalie and I had discussed that we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions as much as possible. So I'll go through this really quickly. However, Natalie, I have to say that in my screen right now, I'm not seeing the chat. So if there are any questions in the chat or something, if you could point that out, that'd be great.
I'm on it for you.
Awesome. Now, so just very quickly, so I'm, as Natalie said, I'm an expert in constitutional law. I've been looking at the recognition of First Nations peoples since this most recent process in 2010 started. But looking much more closely at is really since the last federal election. And we've got a group in our law school called Heart to Heart, which is basically a group of staff and students and other supporters and friends who are doing community outreach events to provide information about the referendum. So in case you're interested in getting someone from our group out to your school or anything like that, in that case, please contact me and then we can take it from there. And just on that also, Natalie will share with you a folder of resources that one of our Heart to Heart volunteers, who is now a law student, made, which is teachers' resources on the referendum. So she used to be a teacher, and she's put together what I think is a really good slideshow on First Nations peoples and the Constitution. Also, a sort of a comic, which is really much targeted, I think, mostly at high school students, but have a look at it, see if you think it might be useful for younger students too, on the same topic. And also, this is in a SACE setup, sort of for a SACE legal studies unit. And what is it? LAP, Natalie, Learning Assessment Plan or something?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, good. But of course, she's also very happy for any of that to be used in a different way. So just wanted to say that these resources are out there, and also I've got links to further resources here on my slides that you're going to get as well. That includes, among other things, our own website, Heart to Heart, and that has other resources, for example, a comic which is sort of made for school students, a pamphlet on sort of general information, a pamphlet on debunking myths on the voice, a crossword puzzle for people who are happy to do something like that. Whatever resources we have, very happy to support you with them. Now, so I want to go through this quite quickly, and what I want to briefly talk about is the Constitution and First Nations peoples, the relation of First Nations peoples to the Constitution, then this road to constitutional recognition most recently, that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and then the proposal for constitutional change as it is on the table now, and the way it's on the table now is definitive. So the Constitution of First Nations, I should also say, because I've had this question asked, so why do I talk about First Nations peoples, not Aboriginal people or so? So obviously Aboriginal people, that would exclude Torres Strait Islander people or Torres Strait Islanders. But the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which, as I'll explain, is the product of a really, really broad grassroots Indigenous peoples consultation across Australia, opted for that term. So they preferred First Nations. And that's why I've started to use that term as well. All right, so Constitution and First Nations peoples. Basically, from the start, First Nations peoples were completely excluded from the Australian Constitution. So this already started when the Constitution was debated, which was in debates in the late 1890s, where, of course, no First Nations people were involved in any of those debates. Now then, once the Constitution had been drafted as such, there were referendums in every state, so every colony at that time, to approve the Constitution. And again, except in South Australia, First Nations people were not allowed to vote on the Constitution. So they really had no involvement. In terms of the text of the Constitution, they were only mentioned by way of exclusion. In other words, it only said that they could not be counted in the census of the Australian people, and that the federal government could not make rules with respect to them. But there was nothing in any way of a recognition, for example, that they are the first peoples of this country, that they have been the inhabitants for the last 65,000 years, anything like that, that they are the oldest cultures in the world. Nothing like that was mentioned in the Constitution. So they were only in there by way of exclusion. Now then, in the 1967 referendum, which you may have heard, it was sort of the big one that was in a way intended to give First Nations peoples more rights. It was supposed to make them equal in Australia. The effect of that referendum was basically that they were completely taken out of the Constitution. So they were no longer mentioned being excluded from the Constitution. Those sections were removed, which means that since 1967, Australian, Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islander peoples are not mentioned in the Constitution at all anymore. So it's called the Great Constitutional Silence. Now, Noel Pearson calls this a period of neutrality. Is that strange? I have to say yes, absolutely. Because in almost all settler countries, and certainly comparable ones to Australia now, First Nations, so the Indigenous peoples of the countries, are acknowledged in the Constitution, usually as the traditional owners, as the original occupants. Their cultures, their languages are often protected and acknowledged, and also they're effectively celebrated of being amongst the oldest continuing living cultures in the world. And certainly Australia, of course, has this incredible, completely unique gift of having cultures that have been here for 65,000 years. That is ancient, you can't compare that to the Incas, the Mayas, the ancient Egyptians, that's all just a few thousand years. We're talking about these extraordinarily old ancient cultures. And so it's extremely unusual for a modern constitution not to recognize this sort of cultural treasure in them. So since 67, they've been excluded. Now, basically, the 2023 referendum is intended to change that. It's supposed to recognize First Nations peoples as the first peoples of this continent in the Constitution. And we'll see if it's going to happen. Now, just briefly, how did this push towards constitutional recognition recently come about? So, First Nations people have basically asked for recognition since the first boats arrived in Australia. So it's a very, very long process. But more recently, basically John Howard in 2007 said that if he gets re-elected, he would put on a referendum in the next term to recognize First Nations peoples in the Constitution. Now, he wasn't re-elected, but since then, this has been basically on government agendas, governments of all political persuasions in some way or another. Now, the most probably important impetus towards the voice came in 2015 through the Kirribilli statement. So we had this large group of indigenous leaders that you see here in the photo coming to Kirribilli House, to the leader of the opposition and the prime minister, so at the time Tony Abbott and Bill Shorten, and basically saying, okay, so now since something like 2010, you've been talking about recognition, you've had sort of appointed government and parliament committees looking at how could First Nations peoples be recognized, but you've never actually asked grassroots, broad-based First Nations people if they want to be recognized in your constitution. And if they do, then how? So how about, you ask them? And with bipartisan support, then a process was started that basically had at its aim to consult widely with grassroots First Nations people, so not elites, not indigenous politicians or business leaders or lawyers or anything like that, but with grassroots people from the communities to find out, do you want to be recognized, and if so, how? And that was done through what was called the First Nations Regional Dialogues. And it was basically that an Indigenous steering committee of 3 Indigenous leaders was organizing dialogues, 12 dialogues and 1 information day all across Australia with First Nations peoples. Now, this is really important. So each of the dialogues was set up based on world best practice for consultation with communities. It was a 3-day process, and each one had the same process of first having basically a civics education section where people, the participants in the dialogues, were sort of brought up to speed with, what is the constitution, what is constitutional change, what are the proposals, the potential proposals for constitutional recognition that are on the table that have been talked about by politicians, etc. So they had the civics education, then they had breakout groups where they were workshopping all these different proposals that had been made, and then coming back together to large plenary sessions. And each of the dialogues basically produced a minutes and a recommendation of whether they would like to be recognized and what they thought about these. I think it was something like 7 different options of constitutional change that were put forward. And now, each of the dialogues is also important, sort of was put together in accordance with a particular formula. So it was hosted by a local First Nations community organization. So for example, in South Australia, by the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement. Now this is a photo from the Adelaide dialogue. Each of the dialogues had 100 participants. They were selected in accordance with a particular formula that you had. They were all First Nations peoples, nothing else. 60% were traditional owners, 20% were sort of other important people in the community, members of the stolen generations, elders, etc. And 20% were representatives of relevant community, Indigenous community organizations. And so these dialogues were held, like I said, all across the country in rural, regional, and city areas. You've got the map here. The most remote one was the dialogue here, which is in Forest River. So this is the location here, right in Central Australia. So it was held all across the country. Now, these dialogues also determined delegates that would take their findings and their determinations from each dialogue to the Constitutional Convention at Uluru. So then in 2017, the National First Nations Constitutional Convention was held at Uluru. All the representatives from all the dialogues basically came together and reported what their dialogues would like to see in terms of constitutional recognition. They debated for another few days at Uluru, and the outcome of that was the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Now, it's an absolutely remarkable document. I would very much recommend that you read it, that you give it to your students to read. It's very short, as you can see. It's a very easy read. And it's particularly remarkable when one considers what outcomes, proceedings or memos or whatever they're called from conventions normally look like, hundreds of pages of report, while this is a very, very powerful, really beautiful, very strong statement. And the three propositions that were put forward. So effectively, this was a consensus statement. Effectively, the consensus was that yes, First Nations peoples would like to be recognized in the Constitution, and they would like to be recognized through a First Nations voice. So this proposal of the voice comes from this very broad grassroots consultation across the country of grassroots First Nations peoples after a very involved discursive process. It might, to be honest, be probably the best ever consultation of any group in Australia that's ever been conducted. And so what they said, we'd like to be recognized in the Constitution through a voice to Parliament and government. And also what we'd like to see is movement towards treaty and towards a truth-telling process. But those two, treaty and truth, were not required to be in the Constitution. So they said the only thing we'd like to see, we'd like to be recognized in the Constitution through a voice to Parliament. And that is where this proposal for the voice comes from. So this is from the 2017, 16-17 consultation with grassroots First Nations peoples. So what is the proposal that is now on the table? And as Natalie said earlier, so the legislation is now passed both House of Parliament, which means it's now very clear what the wording will be. So this is the referendum question that every Australian voter will have to vote on, a proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? Now, this is just the way how referendum questions are usually put in Australia. It's not the most beautiful language, but that's just the way it is. And as Natalie said, people will either have to say yes or no in the box. But what is the actual alteration? So the alteration would add a new chapter to the Constitution, Chapter 9. And the chapter will be called Recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, and a new section, which is section 129, and which is called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. So it starts, when we look at the text, it starts with basically a statement of recognition, because it says in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first people of Australia. So that's really important. And then this is, I should say, this is a very typical constitutional provision. The way it's drafted is very much in line with other constitutional provisions that set up certain bodies of our system of government. So the first subsection simply says that there shall be a body which is the voice. Second section sets out the core function of the voice, which is to make representations to the Parliament and executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the final is that all the details are effectively going to be determined by the Parliament. So which is includes the composition, functions, powers, and procedures of the voice. Again, this is completely normal, that's how it works for all the other parts of Parliament, of the Australian government as well, for example, the High Court or so. Details are always determined in legislation. Okay, so then the question is, well, what do we know about what the voice will look like? Now we can come back to this because I'm conscious of the time. Basically, there are 8 design principles that have been developed and that have been developed again in consultation with First Nations peoples by the Referendum Working Group, and that have been approved by the Cabinet. So what we know about the voice is that it's going to give independent advice to Parliament and government. It's going to be chosen by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people based on the wishes of their local communities. It's going to be representative of these communities. It's going to be gender balanced, and it's going to include youth. It's going to be empowering, community-led, inclusive, respectful, and culturally informed. It's going to be accountable and transparent. There'll be, legislative terms just like with Parliament or so. And so accountability comes also through being chosen again. It's going to work alongside existing First Nations organizations and traditional structures. Now, it's not going to have a program delivery function. It's also not going to handle money in any way, grants program or something. And it's not going to have a veto power over Parliament. And I've set out there the page on the government website where you can find more detail on these design principles. And then the rest of my slides is just further resources, which, like I said, I'm going to set up, share with Natalie, and she'll share it with you. I just want to make one more point in terms of the resources. So one thing that's already very clear is there's a lot of misinformation out there about the referendum and about the voice already. So I think spotting misinformation, identifying misinformation will be really crucial in this process going forward. And so the Australian Electoral Commission's got a really excellent materials there, I think, both in terms of disinformation tactics, as well as this disinformation register of claims that are out there in the public domain about the referendum and that are not true. But then also, I can only recommend the RMIT, so this is University in Melbourne, Fact Lab and Fact Check. Anyone can sign up to their newsletter. They're sending out information once a week about, things that have been in the public domain, and they fact check them by independent experts. There's also a tip line specifically to the referendum. If you find any information about it that you think looks fishy, you can send it to them and they'll fact check it. And another thing, which I think you might also be able to suggest to your students, is the Cranky Uncle app. Now, it's a really good game, which basically on the app shows you or helps you to spot misinformation. So it helps you to spot ways in which misinformation is often portrayed. But that's all I wanted to say. So, does anyone have any questions? You can put them in the chat, but otherwise, of course, also yell out.
They've all been very quiet while you've been speaking, Cornelia, and I feel like they've probably been taking in a lot of what you've been saying. But I'll give everybody a moment to drop in their questions if you have them. I will definitely make sure these resources are sent to you, and Cornelia has so helpfully grouped them for you through university experts, general resources, and then some video explainers. Everything is absolutely fantastic, so I think you'll enjoy going through those afterwards. I'm still not seeing anything come through, Cornelia.
And also, if you have any questions on any of the things you might have heard about the referendum in the discussion generally, that you're not sure about or something, any of the yes or no arguments or something that you've heard that you're not clear on, feel free to ask them as well.
Well, thank you for saying that you're looking forward to the resources. No questions, but thank you for the links provided and covering all the bases.
I might just point out two things, because they have been discussed a lot lately, and I do think fact-checking is important. So there is one argument that keeps being brought up, that the voice would somehow introduce race as a concept into the Constitution. Now, that is completely incorrect. So our Constitution is extremely racist as it is, because it is one of the only ones in the world that actually allows the Parliament specifically to discriminate based on race, and that provision has been in the Constitution since inception, so since 1901. So, so our Constitution is extremely racist. It allows for discrimination. This discrimination occurs in the sense that special laws are being made. Well, so under the relevant section, which is called the racist power, the Commonwealth has been making special laws only with respect to First Nations peoples, never to any other, with respect to any other group. And legislation that you can think of is, for example, native title legislation or cultural heritage protection or laws of this type. Here, of course, in South Australia, the whole Hindmarsh Island Bridge debacle, where basically the Commonwealth Parliament allowed for a development to occur which was against the wishes of the traditional owners. So the Constitution as it is allows a distinction made on race. In fact, it's actually based on that idea. And so this concept that somehow the voice would introduce race in the Constitution is really wrong. I think the other point, which is quite interesting, is that the concept of race, actually, I mean, it's a social construct. It's not in any way scientific, which, you know, genetics and so on has shown us now, and I can provide links for that if you're interested in them, that there is actually no such thing as different races. We're all genetically the same. We're all humans. We have significant differences genetically to certain animals, but there's just no such thing as race in a scientific sense. So this is the one argument. The other one, just to quickly make, that's often made, is why do we need a voice when there are so many First Nations politicians in Parliament already? And it's true that at the moment we have quite a lot. We have 11 First Nations peoples as MPs. So there's a significant difference between their roles, because First Nations parliamentarians are elected in their electorates, and they are responsible to their electorates, which means they basically have to vote and act in the interest of their whole elective, not in the interest of First Nations peoples. They also are, of course, if they're not independent, they are part of a political party. And so under the rules of their own party, they also have to vote in accordance with what the party says, how they should vote. And that is very different from what a First Nations voice might be able to do, because that voice would really be simply responsible for or to its own First Nations communities, and its sole purpose would be to make representations about matters that affect those communities in the interest of those communities. So in other words, they would fulfill a very, very different function compared to current First Nations politicians. And of course, the other point is there's no guarantee that at the next election we'll have any First Nations politicians, because of course we don't know who gets elected. So the difference with the voice again would be that because it would be guaranteed in the Constitution that the voice has to exist, that body would continue to exist, while we don't know if there are going to be any First Nations politicians in the future. Okay.
I think that's a really interesting point too, like where there's no guarantee of our representatives at any point in time. So having something guaranteed in our Constitution provides stability and consistency that our normal electoral processes don't really provide for. I haven't seen any further questions come in, Cornelia. Everyone's just saying thank you. So I'm assuming that means we've just done a really effective job at communicating. That's how I'm going to take it, unless anybody has any comments otherwise. But I'm sure that if you want to send any questions through, or if you need any further support, we would be very happy to help. I'll make sure that you get all of these resources, but Cornelia's heart-to-heart work through the university, they're doing an exceptional job at providing support. So I'm sure their group will be able to help answer any questions about the voice in particular. And if you need any teaching resources or support around the referendum process generally, I'll make sure that that comes through to you through the Electoral Commission, the Parliamentary Education Office, and my sources as well. We've gone a little bit over time, but thank you so much to Cornelia for joining us and for giving us your time this evening.
Natalie, can I just make one final comment? So now that you know a little bit more about the voice and the referendum and how referendums work, please talk to people about it. And also to people in other states, by the way, not just in South Australia, if you can. Because I think it's just, what I would like to see is that people vote really well informed in the referendum. So when they go there, they know what they're voting on, they know what it's all about. So talking not just to your students, but to your networks, your friends, your families, etc., I think would be really great, because we really want everyone to know as much as possible about these matters.
Agreed. This is a dinner time conversation for everybody to have. So for those of you who need to go, thank you so much for your time, and a huge thank you to Cornelia for joining us this week. And for those of you who are still dropping questions into the chat, I'll hang on for just a moment to make sure that you've got all of the links that you need, but I promise everything will be sent to you afterwards as well. So again, thank you, Cornelia, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Keep the conversation going. Let's have some really informed voters. That's all we can ask for. Okay. Good evening, everybody.